everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and in today's episode of Dyepot Weekly, I am going to dip dye 200 grams of Knit Picks Wool of the Andes worsted weight yarn into 3 different colors of jacquard acid dyes. Today's video is sponsored by Ada, and I have a really beautiful colorway planned out that I am sure she will love. I only have one dedicated dye pot, so we are going to be dipping one color at a time and then letting the yarn cool in between. But I'm not necessarily going to be able to exhaust all of the color in the dye pot between each dip. So I am also going to go ahead and pre-soak and prep 100 grams of the Stroll fingering weight yarn. This is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. And I will be using this as almost a mop or a sponge for the leftover dye. And we'll be able to compare how our colorways vary. And who knows, maybe I'll need to get some extra bonus yarn to help mop up the dye, depending on how much color is in the pot. You could plan this out so that way your dips will exhaust all of the dye in the pot. But in none of the steps do I plan to add the entire skein of yarn into the pot of dye. So therefore I sort of want to make sure that I don't want to be standing there for 10 minutes to absorb all of the color in the pot. So that's why I'm expecting that and preparing for the leftover dye and leave no dye left behind while I am prepping this project. I pre-soaked the yarn in some tap water for a couple of hours. The 3 colors we are going to use today are Jacquard Jet Black, Sky Blue, and Fire Red. And I will be starting with some 1% stock solutions that I mixed 6 months ago. I added 12 cups of water to my dedicated dye pot, and now I'm going to add 4 tablespoons, approximately, maybe a little more, of white vinegar. I had planned to do 3 tablespoons and 8 cups of water, but the level of water actually looked a little shallow in the pot. And so that's why I decided to add a little more water to start with and more vinegar. So we've got a good, I don't know, maybe like 4 or 5 inches of depth in this dye pot. Now I am going to let this heat up and we'll start preparing for our first color. Since I plan to use the same dye bath for each of the 3 dips, there might be some residual color left over, but I'm planning on adding enough dye each time that it shouldn't make a huge difference. I just shook up my Sky Blue stock solution, and I'm going to add a 1/2 cup to our dye bath. Now, I did learn in a past video that my stock solutions aren't necessarily consistent in their concentration because of some sediment and not being the most perfect stock solutions. However, I think that we should still be able to get a really, really nice color from this amount of blue. I squeezed out most of the excess liquid from my yarn. And now I'm just getting it set up, keeping my hand in between both hanks so that way we can do our dip dyeing. My plan is to dip less than half of the yarn into blue and leave the other half plain. I expect there will be some overlaps between the dips, but we'll sort of see what happens as we go. Okay, let's get into slowly. I don't mind, and you know, you could go faster. I don't mind if there is, and maybe I'll stop at about here. I don't mind if it's a bit of a gradient with some more intense blue at one spot and less intense at another. This is a lot of color in here. Okay, maybe I've now gone up. I guess I went a little over halfway with the blue. I'm going to go down for one more second so you can see that we do have a lighter portion. But I'm actually going to remove it at this point since I went a little further than I intended. But look at that water that's dripping off. That is clear. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and set this in this dedicated dye metal pan next to me. Actually, you can see the whole skein over there. And I'm trying to keep the white off of the rest of the yarn. I'm gonna let this cool off a bit, but as we're waiting, I am going to dip part of our sock yarn. Now, I think our sponsor Ada will really like these colors that we're doing today. You can see the color's already less intense than what was on the wool. I know that she likes these kinds of shades and she likes really variegated yarn, and so I'm really excited to create this colorway for her. And I have to say, my arm might get tired. Maybe I should set up some kind of system so that way I could dip it and forget it into the dye bath. But if I wanted the colors to strike even faster, I could try adding even more vinegar. But I wanted to make sure to get as intense of a color as I wanted on Ada's yarn. If you would like to learn more about becoming a sponsor of a Dyepot Weekly episode, check out the ChemKnits Creations shop and you'll find some more details there. Alright, we are getting close. There's still some color in the dye bath, so I'm going to give it a tiny bit more. But as you can see, I haven't left, and we have almost completely exhausted it. If it was still looking fairly dark, I mean, now if I go a little further in, you can see it's just a tiny amount of color that is left. It's a little hot, but I'm going to try to drain some of this water. And then I am going to also set this aside. So I've dipped more than half of the skein in the pot. And we'll see how the colors end up coming out. I am pretty excited. How is this for temperature? Picking up Ada's yarn and a little hot. I'm squeezing out some of this water so that way there's a little more water in the pot, but that'll make it also a little easier for me to hold. And I'm going to give this a few minutes to cool off a bit before we start dipping the next color. For dip number 2, I am going to use the red. And once again, I'm going to start off with half a cup of the dye. I find fire red to be almost a cool toned red. It's still a very primary color, but I really, really like it as someone who prefers cool tones to warm tones in general. I quickly went to rinse off my gloves to avoid some color transfer from my hands. Now I'm going to get ready to dip dye the color again. I could shift it so that way I am dipping like this with half of the blue going in. But I still want to keep a little bit of white left for our black. I am going to not shift it, I'm going to shift it like this so that way I can keep some white portion here for the black, but I will also have some dedicated red spot. So we'll see. The color sections might not be particularly even, but let's go ahead and dip into our red. Yeah. Got some nice overlap with the blue, but we still have some section with no red in it that can be colored with our black. I'm actually pretty happy with that color. Now this time, the runoff is red. It's not looking blue right now. Going to shift the other yarn aside to get ready. Alright, I am very, very happy with that color. It is bright and saturated. But you can see that red runoff. We've also got a really nice purple that is in that intermediate section. Okay. I am going to carefully transfer this to our bin. And once again, have it so that way the reds are sort of all sticking down this way with the undyed portion going up there. Now I am prepping our sock yarn. I'm going to do, I think, something similar and dip some portion, leaving some white behind. I will say that the dip and hold gets really hard on your arm. I think that if you had some tongs or something so you could wrap the yarn around and leave it in the pot, or even drape it over the edge to another container, might be a bit easier. That way you could sort of like set it and leave it. I'm going to get a little bit of lighter color for the transition. Actually, leaving it like that does take some pressure off of my arm. Not gonna lie. So some of the reason why I chose this particular color progression to start with, oh dear, I'm not leaving a lot of white left. I gotta pay attention to that. Okay, I'm gonna just try leaving it like that. One of the reasons why I decided to do this color progression is that I wanted to end with the darkest color, because I think if I started with some of the black, it could, I don't know. I just felt that this was a way of layering that made sense to preserve both a true blue and have some true of the reddish tone in there. I mean, maybe this is a bit strawberry. It's not quite as deep as of a red as it could have been. But yeah, this is a beautiful, beautiful color. Okay, so this time, maybe I should just wiggle the sock yarn in here a bit. Alright, I am going to dip and just let it sit for a little bit. You can't really see. Let me shift. Oh, the pot's hot. I'll show you the way that I have this laying out of the edge. But I'm going to give this 5 minutes to see if we can absorb some more of the color. Here is my yarn sitting out of the pot, away from the burner. I think that you could have another container to set it in as well. At this stage, if I weren't trying to get the dye bath to clear as much as I could before the red dip, then I might just take it out at this stage to let it start cooling. But this is, I guess, why I am going this way. And who knows, maybe at the end I'll dip the sock yarn entirely into the black. I have not yet decided. It's been 5 minutes and there's still some color left in the dye pot. But here's a paper towel dipping it in. Oh, blown out a bit. It's pretty pale overall, even though the color is still present. At this stage, I am going to remove the skein and let the excess color run off, which actually the runoff is looking fairly clear. And then I'm going to let this cool aside in our pan, but also I'm going to start getting ready for dip number 3. Here are the 3 skeins of yarn cooling off after dip number 2. For this final color, I am once again going to start with a 1/2 cup of our dye stock. In this case, it is a 1/2 cup of black. And you can see how opaque that is. So I think that tiny amount of red that was left probably is not going to make a huge difference. But if I had left it as it was beforehand, that might have had more influence over our color. So if we take a look at our 2 skeins of yarn, the colorway is not going to be identical, even though these are technically the same dye lot and the same technique. One of them has a slightly larger white patch than the other. Well, actually, oh, is that all one separate skein? Can't tell. They're kind of, yeah, one of them definitely is longer than the other. But I am going to do my best. And this time I'm going to shift them so that that white spot is at the bottom, and dip about halfway, and the overlap portion is about where my hand is. So I think that I've done a pretty good calculation of where all the colors should be. But first I'm turned up the heat a bit since I had turned it down. But I am going to go ahead and start dipping into our black. Decide, it's hard to know about how much halfway is at this point, but I am dipping. Now what's funny is you can see that more of the red is showing through and the blue seems to feel a little more covered up. And that is a lot of color left in there. Wowza. I'm going to bring both hands in to see if I can get like a little light coverage on some of that blue. But okay, yeah. I can definitely see sort of a navy from some of the overlap, and then some more burgundy in there. But that's looking pretty black. I think this also shows the saturation level of some of these different colors really does vary. Like I think the blue in general is less potent than maybe the red and the yellow in terms of the depth of color saturation. And obviously the black has the most. But I think I'm pretty happy with this colorway actually. And I'll let the water run off. And then I'm going to place this aside. There is still a lot of black left in the pot. And I think that this colorway that we got is beautiful. Where the black overlapped the red, I can't tell if it's a burgundy or almost reading a bit brown. But I just love the hues that we got in here. And now I'm going to deal with the sock yarn and the remaining black. There is less white left in this sock yarn skein, but and just from how we're starting, I think that there's a little less black left in here overall. And honestly, I am tempted, well, maybe I'll start, but eventually I think I do want to put this whole thing in. I do want to just sort of have that layer of color, but I'm going to let there be more of the black on one side than the other. And it's getting hot, so I'm going for it. I could have just dipped it, but I'm curious to see just how these layer, if it looks glazed. You know, I could dip for a small amount of time, but I'm going to just leave this in and let it absorb the color. And I'm using this as an opportunity to see, you know, the water still looked pretty opaque when we went in, but am I going to completely cover up everything, or will I have some hues left behind? So far, I definitely see some hues, so I'm not completely nervous, but I am. Oh, that's pretty. Yeah, that water is starting to clear, but I've got like, there's like a navy and a burgundy. I wonder if there's going to be any true black in here, but I'm going to let this go ahead and go for about 10 minutes. While the sock yarn is absorbing the rest of that black, I thought that we would take a closer look at Ada's fabulous yarns. I'm really excited to lay them out so that way I can compare the patches of color. This is a repeating colorway, but some of the colors might read, some of the color changes might be slightly larger on one than the other based on purely the way I was holding them in my hands. And so this is one way when even when you're dyeing 2 skeins of yarn at the same time, and it's the same dye lot, the hues are the same on both. Really, it's not the same as a commercial dye lot where you know that the colorways will be pretty close to identical. There will be a little variation between the 2 skeins. It's been 10 minutes and I just turned off the heat. Now let's remove our sock yarn from our pot of leftover dye. And I definitely still see some reds showing through. And what about the blue? I might see some hints of the blue, but it's a, oh wait, on camera it's a little easier to see. Yeah, the blue is showing through, but I think the blue in general is a little less bright than the red. But we have successfully exhausted all of that dye. It's a little hard to tell while it is steamy and still wet, but I do see some of the blues more in here, but they do feel a lot more gray. And I think that maybe because the black is cool tone anyway, that the warm tones of the reds shift its hue a bit more than the blue. Maybe. Either way, I have to let all of this yarn cool so that way we can wash it and hang it up to dry. I have my 3 skeins of yarn, and now it is time to wash them. I normally don't try to do 3 at once in this little basin, but figured I'd give it a shot today. Let's see. What we're rinsing out is we're looking to see if there's any unbound dye. And it looks like we have a hint of some reddish bleeding, which isn't actually a huge surprise because when I dyed the 100% wool, when I dipped it into the red, the runoff was not clear. So there's probably some of just the red liquid that might still be within that yarn. But here's the second pass, and yeah, it's not clear, but pretty low level. I might need to separate these 3 skeins to rinse a little clearer, but nevertheless, I'm going to add a little bit of some clear dish soap, which also helps dislodge the dye. In addition to excess dye, we are also just rinsing out some of the vinegar. I know some people don't like vinegar smell, and yeah, I guess that's all that could be in here. But yeah, this color coming out is sort of the color that we get in the cleared bath. But anyway, I'm going to keep rinsing until the water runs clear. I might set the soft yarn aside and focus on the wool, but I will only come back if there's something notable about the bleeding. But otherwise, I'm going to hang this up to dry and come back to show you the finished dry yarn. Here are the 2 skeins of yarn that we dip dyed side by side into first the sky blue, then the fire red, and finally jet black acid dyes. I dip dyed them at the same time and rotated the skeins a bit throughout so that way we could layer these colors onto the yarn. And the results are that we have 2 skeins that are definitely the same colorway, and they are technically the same dye lot. The hues are the same in each of them, and they were dyed in the same pot at the same time. However, are these skeins of yarn identical? No. When we look at them laid out side by side, you can see that the one on the bottom has a shorter patch of the true red and a longer patch of the intermediate purple, whereas the one on top has less of the purple and a little more of the red. And it's possible that some of these additional intersection colors might vary in the length that they are. Now, if you're knitting one project with both of these yarns and You don't want the switch between skeins to be super abrupt. You can mix them up with one another and sort of alternate skeins every couple of rows to mix them together. Ultimately, these are pretty closely matched, and I think that the different hues and the way those play into each other are really, really beautiful. This purple I don't think I've actually mixed this red and blue together before, but this purple that we get between the blue and the red is sort of, it's a rich plum sort of shade, and it's gorgeous. I am really, really excited the way that these hues sort of mix together and interplay with one another in the purple section, because we have different, since it was dip dyed, we have more of a gradient in between the two. The black mixed with the two colors in a really nice way too. I think that what we have is more, it's sort of a matte black versus a true black in the darkest section. But then we have something that's more of like a slate blue navy and something that's going towards a burgundy. The darkest section has a warmth to it. So maybe it's a warm reddish black almost versus sort of a cool ink black. The way that you have these laid out actually changes the perception of the depth of tone. When I had them laid with the darkest section along one side, it made the skein look like it was really dark, but there is a lot of warmth in it, even with some of the cooler tones. And I think that this could turn into something really, really gorgeous. Finally, we have our Stroll sock yarn, which mirrors some of the darkest tones in here, because I did eventually add the entire skein of yarn into the black. I decided that I just wanted to go for it and see how it would be different. And I think that it's really fun how this interplays with the other yarns in terms of the tones and everything else. Superwash yarns in general tend to have the dye strike a little faster, which gives us a little more of some of this modeling throughout it. Even like if you open up the hank a little bit, you can see some lighter tones on the inside. And you definitely can still see some modeling and variation in the 100% wool skeins as well. So ultimately, paying attention and knowing a little bit about your yarn base can really influence the way that not only the colors strike, but the type of technique that you might want to use on that yarn. Ultimately, I really, really love commercial acid dyes. I think that playing with food coloring still comes more naturally to me because I have a better feel for how the colors mix and the intensity of the colors. But I do know that getting these deep, rich, more jewel-like tones is something that is a bit harder for me to achieve with food coloring because of the way that colors break, etc. You tend to still have some of these bright notes. But even when you're playing with colors that don't break at all, you still can create these stunning colorways through dip dyeing. You just might need to do multiple dips and play around with multiple colors to get the different hues in your yarn. There are some commercial acid dyes that will break. I just haven't played around with any of those tones yet, but I am really excited to play with those at some point in the future. So not only is this a good case for, using up all of your leftover colors, but you can also use black or really almost any dark color to tone down some of your brighter shades. Personally, I also love the layered look when you add multiple colors on top of each other, but that is just one of my favorite things. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I would like to give One more huge thank you and shout out to today's sponsor, Ada. Thank you so much for sponsoring this episode of Dyepot Weekly and supporting the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. If you would like to learn more about sponsoring an episode of Dyepot Weekly, you can check out the listing in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy store. I'll have a link to it in both the video description and the iCard. Don't forget to subscribe to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel, where you can find weekly, fun, awesome, and exciting yarn dyeing videos. Thank you so much for watching.